will give everyone just a minute to join. So as we wait to those who are already a part of the webinar, please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are in the world. You can just try and get to know each other before we begin. We'll be beginning in about a minute. Sophia from Mexico City. Hi. Let's just see if we get a few more introductions in the chat. I've just popped a message there. So I think we can start. It's 5 minutes past the hour. Let me just introduce myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Ranger. My pronouns are they, them. And I wanted to welcome all of you to the final day of the Code for All 2022 Summit. The session you've joined today is called Dollars for Change, How to Fund Accessibility, and we'll be exploring how nonprofits have successfully funded accessibility initiatives, research, and products. This is a panel discussion where each speaker will present, panelists will have a group discussion, and then there will be room for a Q&A at the end. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A instead of the chat box, and we'll answer them either via text or out loud at the end of the session. Our speakers today are Whitney Pfeiffer from the National Democratic Institute, Bonnita Nyamwire from Pollicy, Ariel Simms from RespectAbility, Gavin Freegard from mySociety, and Sophia was not able to join us as a speaker, and she does send her apologies. So let me just quickly introduce our first speaker, Bonnita. Bonnita is the head of research and at Pollicy Uganda. She oversees and manages all aspects of research in the department for both qualitative and quantitative research projects. Bonnita is also a mentor to junior members of the research department, as well as partners that collaborate with Pollicy Uganda. Her area of specialization is digital rights, research, and advocacy. So Bonnita, please go ahead. You have around 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here and in this summit for this session. So that's the introduction. That's about me, and I'll not go over it again. I'll just straight away go into how Pollicy has been able to fund accessibility or get funding for accessibility. I'll straight away talk about that. So maybe briefly, Pollicy is civic technology company based in Kampala in Uganda, and our focus is on data governance, civic technology, data use. So we work with civil society organizations and the government to see that data is used in the way it should be used, curated in the right ways, and all around data. So about our topic today, I will talk about a project that we had on accessibility, and this was about persons with disabilities access to use of ICTs and assistive devices, and how were we able to win, for instance, funding for this project. So the project focused on, first of all, we were able to get funding for this project because that is our area of specialization as policy, ICTs and technology. And so focusing on the area of assistive devices for persons with disabilities, looking at their access and use was also very important for our niche as policy. So to win this funding, we looked at the problem area. So we focused on an area where there is high prevalence of disability in Uganda, which is northern Uganda. And this is because of the insurgency that happened in that area. So the prevalence goes up to 20%, 17%, in some districts, 18%. So focusing on an area where the problem is very high, the prevalence is very high, was very key in getting this funding. Then also in this accessibility project, we also ensured that the project was inclusive, but also as well as diverse in terms of the target population. We did not focus on one category of persons with disabilities. We focused on all the categories of persons with disabilities so that we do not leave anyone behind. So that is very key in trying to win any funding for accessibility. So that was about diversity of the target population. Then also the other consideration was involvement of stakeholders that work with persons with disabilities, which was very key. So we thought of that if we involve key stakeholders that work with persons with disabilities, and these are civil society organizations for persons with disabilities, we would be able to get easy access or entry into the communities in terms of mobilization, in terms of research, in terms of data collection, because we needed to be inclusive at all stages of data collection, for instance, to involve people who can work with those who have visual impairments, those who have hearing impairment. So involving stakeholders was also another key that helped us to win that funding for that project. Then also co-creating with the target population. So we also decided that we'll be co-creating at every stage with the target population, especially in developing small and simple interventions for the target population as part of the outcomes for the project. So those were very key in winning us funding for that project. And then also including, of course, some representatives apart from these other stakeholders that work with persons with disabilities. There were other persons with disabilities that were involved in the project, for instance, in the different stages of development of the proposal, development of the concept, conceptualizing the idea. So at all different stages. So all those steps were able to win us funding for that project, which was on accessibility for persons with disabilities in the northern part of Uganda. I can stop there for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Bonnita. That was a very illuminating, and I'm sure we're all eager to hear more once we go to the question and answer session. I'll now move on to our next panelist, Gavin. Gavin Freegard is a freelance consultant working with mySociety on their TICTeC Labs program. He is also an associate at the Institute for Government, a special advisor at the Open Data Institute, and a member of the Public Digital Network. He has also done work for other civil society organizations, including Full Fact, the Royal Statistical Society, the Alan Turing Institute, and the Ada Lovelace Institute. So Gavin, take it away. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good afternoon or good evening to everyone from here in North London. As you've already heard, I've been working with mySociety here in the UK, a not-for-profit group which pioneers the use of online technologies to help empower citizens towards greater civic participation. And we're interested in transparency, democracy and community as well. And we've just actually been through a project, as Mark mentioned, the TICTeC Labs Project, where we were involved in funding some work about accessibility and inclusivity. So I thought I'd talk to you about our experience of doing that, and hopefully we can learn a few things along the way. So just to give you a very quick introduction to the project, TICTeC, or the Impact of Civic Technology Conference, was an annual conference where we brought together people from across the globe. Obviously, that wasn't possible over the last couple of years. So thanks to the National Endowment for Democracy, very quickly pivoted to a very different model. We appointed a steering group of some civic tech practitioners from across the globe. We asked them to pick 6 common challenges for civic tech organizations, which everyone faces. And for each of those challenges, we then came up with a 3-stage process in order to commission some funded work. The first process was a civic tech surgery for people to come together and discuss and list the challenges they were facing, start thinking about some of the solutions to them. Then the next stage was an action lab of 6 or so people to help bring those ideas down to something that we could commission. And then finally issuing a call for proposals with up to $3,760 available. So we could actually get somebody to do some of the work. Now, our second civic tech surgery, which involved Mark and Bonnita, actually, was a fantastic event. And I'm going to put a link to it in the chat so you can all look at the resources. Our second event was all about accessibility and inclusion. How can we ensure that civic tech is accessible? How can we lead and popularize best practice? So all the resources are in that link. But just to talk you through some of the common challenges that came up. So the things that people want to be able to tackle, hopefully with funding. The first was that there was a lack of user-centered design practice in civic tech in general. People are often building things very, very quickly without taking user needs into account. And that definitely applies sort of extra when it comes to people with extra accessibility needs. And it's something that we're recognizing at the moment. mySociety is rebuilding the TICTeC website, and that's something that we're trying to bear in mind as we go. Second big thing was in-house culture. There's often not structure within civic tech organizations to ensure that accessibility is built in at the beginning of every project. It's seen as a bolt-on at the end. In fact, I think it was Mark that cited an excellent tweet which said, accessibility isn't more work, you were just cutting corners before, which I think is absolutely right. There was also a problem with a lack of expertise. Civic tech teams are small and may not have that accessibility knowledge in-house. There are, of course, lots of differing needs when it comes to accessibility, including sort of language and literacy. It's quite easy to misunderstand users. Engagement by those who are struggling to use the service can be misinterpreted as misuse or abuse. And of course, one of the final big thing that everybody came up with was that a lack of funding. Funding sources don't always recognise the necessity for the time and resource that is needed to make sure that things are accessible. And funders often prefer to fund new things rather than give additional funding to existing ones, which might allow them to become more accessible. So we then discussed the various solutions and that we might want to fund, what was already out there, what people were already trying to do. And I think a really important point there is that there's already quite a lot of really good work that people can access to help them when it comes to making things more accessible. Universal Access Guide by Code for All, for instance, or accessguide.io, or the Accessibility Project, which is a11yproject.com. So there are things that are out there that can help. Our action labs, the 6 people that we then brought together to try and come up with a call for proposals, considered a number of different options of things that we might want to fund. There were some things around surveys to try to understand users and their needs, whether that was a template for organisations to pick up or commissioning one ourselves, a template for documents, guiding documents that can help organisations approach accessibility. Bring a consultant in to try and audit existing websites and identify and fix issues. There were lots of things around, so toolkits and guidance, whether that was overarching, like what we mean by accessibility, the top tips for making changes, things for funders to understand as well, or much more specific ones about how to communicate in multiple languages. Training was another thing that came up, literature review of what was already out there, and accessibility, develop a core, so a list of people who do specialise in this sort of thing, producing a guide for funders on why funding to make civic tech more accessible is important and should be built into every grant, not a bolt-on, creating and supporting a community of practice, commissioning digital badges to show how good websites are when it comes to accessibility and inclusivity, or creating standardized accessibility-focused user personas that can be referenced when designing civic tech tools. So a huge range of different things that we could have funded. Of course, we only had $3,760 available. And I think that's one of the challenges that we faced. I think another challenge was that some of those options that you've heard, including the one that we went with, which was creating a practical guide for civic tech practitioners on how to incorporate accessibility in their work. Some of those things are one-offs, which are slightly more easy to fund, whereas some things like a community of practice could be really transformative, but takes a lot of ongoing support and a lot of ongoing maintenance. It wasn't something that we thought was possible with the funds that we had available. So we awarded, we put the call for proposals out, which was coming up with that sort of resource or toolkit, awarded it to Technoloxia, who are a Tunisian organisation or Tunisian-based organisation. So they're currently working on that. They're working with team members with disabilities and with trained practitioners in a focus group of very different users with very different accessibility needs as well. Something that our action lab was very, very insistent on was that whoever won the bid would need to make sure they were speaking to users with different accessibility needs. So that was very important to them. We'll see what happens with that work in due course. But I suppose just in summary, again, we're really pleased that we were in a position to be able to fund something. There are lots of good ideas out there that are sort of eminently fundable. There are lots of ideas out there that have already been done in some way. So I think there is also something about not reinventing the wheel and building on a lot of the good work that's already been done. But again, one of the things that we weren't able to fund was how do we make funders take this issue more seriously? And again, make sure that it's something that's built in and not just a bolt-on. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. And yeah, that last point of it being built in from the start is really important. And Pollicy actually have a great report on making sure accessibility is not just something you add at the end. So it seems that's a common theme. So on to our next speaker, Whitney Pfeiffer. Whitney Pfeiffer is a program manager for inclusion at the National Democratic Institute, supporting teams to be more intentional about the inclusion of citizen voices and marginalized groups, including persons with disabilities, LGBTQI communities, and ethnic and religious minorities in NDI programs. So Whitney, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mark, and really happy to be here. The National Democratic Institute is an international non-governmental organization based in Washington, D.C., but presence in anywhere between 55 to 60 countries at any given point in time. And we work to advance democracy and governance and human rights issues around the world. And my particular role does focus on the inclusion and civil society side of things. So I'm going to skew the conversation a little bit further away from the civic tech side, as that's not my expertise. The expertise is more on the inclusion. And I think NDI sits at a really interesting kind of middle point in the fact that we fund we fund organizations to carry out democracy and governance programs, but we also have very close relationships with the donors who are funding those programs. So I would say, NDI sees disability inclusion and accessibility as inherent to being inherent to achieving sustainable democratic outcomes. We know that programs are much more likely to succeed when they are inclusive and accessible. And I think to Gavin's point, there is research that does show that programs are going to be more expensive if accessibility is treated as an add-on rather than as a part of the design process and then further the implementation process. So NDI, we do our best to try and live our mission and values. And one of those is having expectations of our partners about what we should be looking for in their activities and how inclusive they are in their activities. We're slowly starting to see a recognition that our partners' budgets need to include accessibility budgeting, and also think about accessibility when they are putting on events, both in person and online. And so a lot of that is making the argument to our partners and helping them really understand the value add of accessibility. I think it's important to remember that this is all part of these conversations around universal design, and the fact that accessibility doesn't just benefit persons with disabilities, benefits everyone. I benefit from being able to read captions sometimes, or being able to take in information in multiple formats, because we all learn in different ways. So making the case is really important, and I think it will require groups, organizations that are funding these partners like NDI to take a more intentional approach in our expectations of our partners. We're starting to see this a lot more among our disabled persons organization partners, but I would like to see us expand it to our broader civil society partners, our civic tech partners. And I think the more that we're able to kind of get our partners used to budgeting for and planning for accessibility, the more we're going to see it become less of a conversation of, oh, this is too much to do, and more of this is something that we must do. On the donor side, I think, fortunately, inclusion has become less of a niche topic and more of a mandated topic. And I think as inclusion has evolved over time, over the last probably about 10 years, donors are starting to again see that the inherent value of ensuring that the programs that they're funding are inherently accessible and inclusive. So we've actually seen, even in the last couple of years, a shift particularly in the US government, around their expectations around accessibility. So now what used to be a, why do you have a reasonable accommodation line in your budget question is now a, why is your reasonable accommodation percentage so low? Can you increase it? Which has been great to see. I think it's also important to draw attention to the fact that there are a lot of governments and donors out there, foundations and government donors, that have put out disability strategies. And that is one really effective way to continue to advocate and push for accessibility. And if you include accessibility in your programs and the government pushes back on you but they have a disability strategy, it's an effective accountability tool to say, well, your disability strategy says otherwise. So the UK FCDO has a disability strategy, the UN, the European Union, and we're seeing many more coming out across, kind of those larger international donors. And that includes the fact that they will be looking for accessibility when they are looking at reviewing proposals and figuring out who's receiving funding. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing that's also important to think about when you're thinking about accessibility is the fact that every couple of years there's a global disability summit, and the last one took place just this past February, and a slew of international organizations, government organizations put forward a set of commitments in each of their kind of respective areas. You can find those online. I'll put the commitments link in the chat. But that's another effective way on how to advocate for accessibility to a donor, to a government, to a foundation, because you can say, well, your commitments have said that you are looking to fund more accessible programs or advance accessibility in your programming. So we need, this is why we are putting forth these kind of expectations. I think the important thing, again, to remember is the fact that, persons with disabilities make up 15 to 20% of the world's population, and therefore are going to make up about 15 to 20% of the participants that you engage in your programs. And therefore, that is why accessibility is important. And I hope that eventually we'll get to a point where we transition from the conversation of why do we need this to we need this. And I think the final thing that I'll reiterate is this importance of partnerships. Partnering with disabled persons organizations and members of the community is essential. They know what the needs are. They know what they need to be able to participate. They may even actually be able to help you alleviate some of the costs because they might have resources available to them. They may be able to point out accessible venue spaces or online platforms that they've used that are low cost. So I think it's important, again, that, that this all be in response to the needs of persons with disabilities, the expressed needs, and partnering with them to really kind of understand what is going to ensure that these principles of universal design, nothing about us, are all applied going forward.
Thank you so much, Whitney. And yes, the Code for All team does work with NDI quite closely, including around accessibility as well. So I'm sure they're grateful for your support. And now we move to Ariel Simms, who is the president and chief executive officer of RespectAbility, a nonprofit organization fighting stigmas and advancing opportunities so people with disabilities can fully participate in all aspects of community. I'm really excited to hear from you. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Ariel Simms. My pronouns are they, them, or she, hers. I'm a white non-binary person with chin-length red hair. I'm wearing a multicolored top, and I have a virtual background with RespectAbility's logo behind me. So I'm bringing a different perspective to the panel today as both someone who is disabled, but also leading a disabled persons organization. And I'll sometimes say, of course, DPO for short. So that's what I'm referring to when I say that. At RespectAbility, we are generally a US-based NGO, and we are cross-disability and disability-led. Disability-led, and then approximately, we just did a new identity survey, about 85% of our staff disabled, and we also have a majority disabled board of directors too. So that really a lot of different perspectives, experiences, and expertise that we can bring to the table. When it some of the work that we do, as Mark mentioned, advance opportunities and try to fight stigma so that every disabled person can have a full life in the community and can access, in particular, the workforce is something that's very important to us in the US. We do our work across 4 key programmatic areas. One, we look at fighting stigma in entertainment. So the next time you're enjoying a big feature film or a television series, we are working behind the scenes to make sure that there is authentic representation both on the screen and behind the camera, and that's a big part of the work that we do. We also work in areas of faith inclusion, making sure every individual disabled person who wants to participate in a faith community has the access and the opportunity to do so. We also engage in policy advocacy, and then one of our probably most robust areas is also around leadership, support disabled to continue growing in their leadership. And we also create leadership pipelines to ensure that disabled individuals are getting into the sectors that most in the lives of individuals with disabilities, and that includes philanthropy as well, and trying to get more folks who are disabled into philanthropy. So on the flip side, won't be so hard to get the funding that we need for these great initiatives that everyone has been talking about. So when it comes to the challenges with funding accessibility, I mean, we often face the same challenges that civic tech organizations and corporations and just many other types of entities are facing. Something to acknowledge is that the disability community is not a monolith. We are incredibly diverse, and we come to the table with all kinds of access needs. And sometimes those things are competing, right? Someone's access need might be a barrier to someone else. So that can create a challenge in funding for accessibility. I think the biggest thing that we tend to see out in the field, and other folks have mentioned this, that accessibility is not viewed as essential or a necessity, but instead it's often viewed maybe as overhead or a nice to have or some kind of administrative expense. And a lot of funders really don't care to fund that kind of expense for sure. Some of the access services folks need to participate can be quite expensive. Thinking about the more disabilities or the more access needs or the more rare the type of access service is, all can increase costs and can make it harder to get those things funded. With the COVID world that we're living in today, I think we've also started to experience a rise in not only the virtual world, which in many ways did make accessibility a bit easier. But now we're also facing this dilemma of the hybrid world, where we're trying to fund accessibility both in a virtual world and in person at the same time. And it tends to be much more expensive than either being solely in person or solely virtual. And that's created a challenge, I think, for funding. And of course, just the kind of the age-old funder consideration that they've always preferred to fund new projects and innovative work. And many of the access solutions we have today are the access solutions we had 10, 15, 20 years ago. So there's not always as much innovation happening because we stick with what works for us. So I wanted to share a bit about how we fund our own accessibility work as an NGO. We do also provide training and consultation to other organizations, government entities, corporations. So if your organization is looking for additional support, ideas, consulting, training, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll make sure I put my email address in the chat box. So for us, because we are a disabled persons organization, access is not an option, right? It is essential. It's part of the very fabric of who we are. And so it's built into our organization from the ground up. And as we continue to work on our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, it's also an essential part of that strategy. So we talk about, instead of DEI, we talk about DEIA, and always add that access piece as part of that overall strategy. I mentioned earlier that we do inclusive philanthropy work. So one of the things that we try to do is not wait for funders to get it. We go to them and say, here's how we can help you be more inclusive as a funder and meet the needs of the disabled community. And here's what that looks like. So we offer inclusive resources, toolkits, et cetera. And you can find many of those things on our websites. And please feel free to share them directly with your funders that you think might need a little bit more education or inspiration to be more prepared to fund this kind of work for sure. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of pipeline work. So we host what we call fellows or apprentices within our organization who are disabled and wanting to pursue careers in different sectors, including philanthropy. So we're also maybe in a sense cheating a bit because we're trying to get more disabled folks into philanthropy to make that case for us so we don't have to continually educate the funders ourselves. Some practical considerations are to build your access costs into your projects. So if you're working on a grant or you're working on a consulting project, even if the funder doesn't say affirmatively, you can build those costs in, build them in, right? And when the funder asks about that line item, have the conversation. I've had many productive conversations with funders when they say, what is this line about access services? And we can then talk about what it means to have captions and the difference between live captioning and an automated captioning service, or having sign language interpretation, or having deafblind interpretation. So it just does create a really nice opportunity to provide that education. So even if they don't say it's permitted, put it in your budgets, put it in your funding requests, because it at least creates that space for that conversation and hopefully some education for the future. If you do consultation and training work, you can always build it into your client, what you're charging the client, right? Pass those costs along. And again, it's an opportunity for education. If there's pushback on why are you charging X amount for this particular service? And that can be a really helpful strategy too. And then overall, as an NGO, we're constantly thinking about how we can continue to diversify revenue. We know that we can't consistently rely on the same things. So we're constantly thinking about how do we both get more unrestricted revenue that we can use for whatever we need? How can we get more grants? How can we build an investment portfolio? So lots of kind of other bigger strategies too, to make sure that we have the funding we need. So I won't say too much about including disabled people in projects because that's what we do and that's what we're here for. So I'll just echo the other panelists that it's incredibly important. And I just would add that when you're working with DPOs and disabled individuals, please pay them for their expertise. Pay us for our expertise, because that goes a long way in setting that stage and that tone that we are expertise on our own access needs and what we need out in the community and as part of different projects. So build that into your budgets as well to pay folks for that expertise. And the last thing I'll add, there was so much good stuff added, I won't repeat it, but I'll just add one new thing, is that sometimes you do need to make that legal or discrimination case argument. And that can look like, we're based in the United States, so we do often use things like the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Rehab Act, but most of you coming from around the world, your countries have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and it absolutely addresses access and accommodation. So when you need to, you can make that case as well. So with that, I'll wrap up.
Thanks so much. I saw your organization has partnered with Netflix. You mentioned, the entertainment kind of advisory side. So that's, I'm sure that's pretty cool. I guess now I'll just throw some questions at you, and we'll start, I guess, in reverse order. So Ariel, we're back to you, if you don't mind. So you do run a successful organization, and I wanted to ask you if you could just give one piece of advice to other organizations in this space on how to kind of ensure that their funding is stable and sustainable, because donors come and go. So, how can organizations think around, making sure that they have sustainable funding over time? If you could just give one thing that someone can kind of do.
Well, I might give two. I'll say diversify. So, look at the kinds of funding you have, but then more importantly, think about the kinds of funding you have, right? And think about where you can find other pots of dollars, where you could look for other funding possibilities. If you've really been focused on individual donors, for example, go look at foundations and government entities and corporations. They all have different pots of money that they might be able to offer you. And then the second piece I would say is don't stick with just the disability funders or funders that say they focus on disability. I think that's like the #1 mistake that we sometimes make when we're looking for funding for this work, because the reality is the disability community is a marginalized community. And because of that, there are many other funders who maybe don't realize it quite yet, but they would possibly be interested in supporting projects that impact this community. So look for funders that are promoting racial justice, that are promoting LGBTQI+ equity, and make the case that, look, those of us who are disabled, we live at many intersections. So if you're funding racial justice and you're not thinking about disability, you're missing the mark. And I think that would be my biggest piece of advice.
Thanks. Yeah, intersectionality. That's pretty important. Thank you. Whitney, if I can move over to you, just from a funding or a donor standpoint, I'm curious how you include disabled people in kind of the key decision-making processes, so that these initiatives aren't, sorry to put it this way, like at the mercy of people who are not in the community. So how do you think that your organization or other organizations can kind of ensure that disabled people are present, are in the room, are at the table when these decisions are being made?
Yeah, so I would say that, NDI takes a very humble approach to disability inclusion and accessibility. We acknowledge that we are not a disabled persons organization. We are democracy, governance, and human rights. And although disability cuts across all of those areas, the expertise really does lie in our partnerships with our disabled partners organizations, persons organizations. We acknowledge that they know best. They have the expertise, and it's a part of that concept of nothing about us without us. They are the experts, and that if you are not intentionally and purposefully including them and ensuring that their seat at the table is meaningful, then you're going to cause harm, and you really shouldn't be doing the project or acting in that way at all. And so I think for us, it's about living those values, and my role is to ensure that we are living those values, not in a superficial way, but in an intentional and purposeful way. So I think the thing to remember is, again, that disability activists, disabled persons organizations, they know exactly what the needs are. They know what the priorities are. They can express them. They are often far more advanced than some other civil society organizations in certain countries. They know the lay of the land. They know what the challenges are, and therefore they need to be engaged in these conversations. So we have, when we design programs, we mandate that there are conversations with disabled persons organizations. We mandate that there are subgrants going to these DPOs who are working in this space. And I think we've also benefited from the fact that we've done this work for a really long time. It's always been a priority. So we have a very vast network, and we have close relationships with government donors who have expectations of what they want to see from us in our partnerships. And so it's about living our values in that way and fulfilling those principles and ensuring we're not doing harm. And again, taking that kind of humble approach to acknowledging that we know democracy, governance, and human rights, and that our knowledge stops there, and that we need to be engaging our disability partners in a meaningful way to ensure that programs are, impactful, accessible, and actually going to move the needs forward in a tangential way.
Thank you. Humble approach. That's pretty interesting, and I think pretty important as well. But just by the way, to the other panelists, if you at any point want to add or jump in, please do raise your hand. I hope I'm not grilling everyone individually. We can all discuss. So Gavin, if I can move over to you, you did mention that the Action Lab that was kind of looking at creating solutions around accessibility, specifically within civic technology. I was wondering, what key lessons, other than the recommendations of the surgery, from where you sit as somebody who's kind of been involved in the project from inception to where it is now, what lessons have you learned that you think can be shared with other organizations that are kind of working on similar initiatives?
Great question. Great question. Don't quite know where to start. I think. For me, coming to it, just treating this as something that needs to be built in, not bolted on, was absolutely vital. I think too often we can move very quickly at pace when it comes to civic tech, and indeed various other campaigns in civil society as well. And it's far too easy for far too many people not to put this at the centre of what they're doing. So if nothing else, I think the first step to solving anything is making sure that it's something that everyone has to talk about. Is really important, and that I think is one of the key lessons that we've taken away. I think one of the others is to sort of look in on ourselves and to make sure that we're trying to do better with a lot of the issues that were raised in the Action Lab. I was speaking to one of our developers, our web developers, the other day, and I mentioned that we are now redesigning the TICTeC website, and again, accessibility is going to be at the heart of that, using a lot of the resources that I mentioned. Just to give an example, they're looking at various accessibility issues, hoping to speak to users about what would be more useful, using various accessibility tools to assess what our websites currently look like and what they need to look like. So, for instance, classifying different sorts of challenges, whether it's design issues, things like color contrast, development issues, things that might cause a screen reader to struggle, for example, and content issues where we might not have alt text for some of the images, and again, various other screen reader issues, and trying to prioritize. I think it's sort of trying to draw on the lessons of the Action Lab to improve our own work as well, especially with something like the TICTeC project, where there was a lot of reading. There are apparently a lot of infographics which aren't particularly accessible for a lot of people. So again, it's sort of reflecting in on ourselves and seeing if we're able to lead by example to a greater extent than perhaps we have to date.
Yep, very, very important as well. And Bonnita, I just wanted to ask you, as somebody who does live in the global majority, you are in Uganda, I'm right over the lake in Kenya. I was wondering what your view is on, how can you kind of push for accessibility in a place where it's not really a priority. It's not written in law that tools need to be accessible to disabled people. From your experience at Pollicy, what has been the key way that you've managed to kind of get projects on the ground in such an environment?
Thank you, Mark. I think for us, it has been working with civil society organizations that work with persons with disabilities and other stakeholders, for instance, the government that also work with persons with disabilities. I will go back to give an example of the project that we had for persons with disabilities. We felt it very important to involve CSOs that work with PWDs in that area in northern Uganda, and this helped us right from the beginning up to even the simple and small interventions that we had for them, which were awareness raising around assistive devices. So working with CSOs and CBOs, community-based organizations that work with persons with disabilities, is very, very important in implementing all those policies and laws. I know in Uganda, the policies and laws are there for persons with disabilities to access services, but they are not fully implemented. So, but working with the CSOs that work with these persons is very important to try and implement them, even at the local level. Then the other one is involvement of the government stakeholders that again work with these persons with disabilities. For instance, in Uganda, the Ministry of Education has several projects they are implementing that are looking at inclusive education. So, and the Ministry of Gender is also implementing projects with persons with disabilities that are also looking at inclusion, economic empowerment for persons with disabilities. So we tried as much to work with those key government entities that work with these persons to implement whatever we were able to implement. We also looked at various stakeholders. We looked at academic institutions that also have projects with persons with disabilities. There's a university in Uganda called Chambogo University. They have a whole faculty for special needs. They do training. They do enroll students with special needs, all different kinds of special needs, and they attain university education. So we worked with them also on how we would implement certain sections of our project. So it was a concerted effort, and that is what it needs to be. So working with stakeholders from the different levels, even the lowest level, you know, like the local councils that we have in Uganda, we involve them. The district, we involve the community development officers at the district level. So this helps to own the project. This helps to own the policies and the laws. So because implementation of the policies of the laws does not begin at the top. Ideally, it should begin at the lowest level, at the bottom. So involving all those stakeholders at the different level helps them to work with the community, helps them to own, to understand even these policies, because some of them may not actually understand these policies. They are written maybe in using terminologies that they do not understand. But when you work with different stakeholders, you are actually able to see it, look at them, simplify them, put them in the easiest language that they can be easily understood and also implemented. So then the other one is the inclusiveness part of it. For instance, in our project, we tried to be as inclusive as possible, because if we are saying we are working for persons with disabilities, and then we do not have a sign language interpreter, we do not have any materials catering for people with visual impairments, then we are getting it wrong. So in our project, we actually made sure that most of the products that we had, they could be easily relatable to the community, to the target population. For instance, as part of our inclusion measures, we produced our report in Braille print and large in Braille print and large format, so that the people with visual impairments were also able to access this report. We also had the audio and video insert with a sign language person, so that those with hearing impairments but understand sign language were able to also understand what were the findings, what were we communicating in the whole project. So inclusion was also very helpful on our part. We also included people who are in the private sector in terms of those who produce materials for persons with disabilities. For instance, we had Enabling Services Uganda Limited. We had Nudipu, which is an umbrella organization for persons with disabilities. So when we would go to the field, for instance, we would go with Enabling Services Limited. They would come with some of the assistive devices. They show them to the persons, you know, that was very helpful in implementation. So bringing together different stakeholders at different levels to help interpret the processes, the laws, the policies, put them in the local context, you know, in the local language. Localization, contextualization, and involvement of different stakeholders at different levels is very key.
Thank you, thank you. That's really, really important, and it's good to see there is an approach that actually works in places like Africa that may not have, you know, the frameworks that other places do. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. We do have just under 10 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. For those of you who are in the room, please do put your question in the Q&A box, and I'll try and get it to the panelists. While we wait, you know, I've heard a lot of interesting perspectives today on, you know, stuff like co-creation, you know, the hybrid model, and what that's doing in the accessibility space. So I just wanted to ask, and this is a question that I'll just put to the entire panel. What do you think the future of accessibility, especially within the nonprofit space, looks like, based on your experience?
This is Ariel, I can start. I think the future is bright. You know, with the global pandemic, it obviously was incredibly harmful in so many ways, but I think one, I don't even think I could call it a benefit, but one thing it also revealed was the need for accessibility and the need for this in the virtual world and in the physical world. And so in that sense, I think we have people paying attention to access in a way that they never had before. So I think we'll continue to see more universal attempts at access. I think we're also, of course, going to continue to see the rise of long COVID, and we're going to be continuing to add newly disabled individuals to the global community. And I think that will in turn hopefully lead to increased activism and advocacy around these issues. So I think there's definitely lots of possibility there. And I do hope that we also tend to move towards universal design and talk about access for everybody, and not make it so disability specific either, and really make sure everyone is just bought in that all of our spaces, virtual or in person, need to be inclusive.
I think we might have lost Ariel there. So I'll just throw it back to anyone else who might have some thoughts on, you know, what the future looks like for accessibility.
And this is Gavin. I think I'd just echo that excellent answer. And I think it's something that I think some of the incentives are also changing, not only given the sort of move to online and hybrid, which is really put a focus on all of this. I think, as a few of the panelists said earlier, I think governments are now starting to take this quite seriously. There have been changes here in the UK about government websites needing to be much more accessible. And I think, as Ariel was saying, that's also part of the drive to just generally improve user experiences, which again I think it's always a tension when things are rightly mainstreamed and when they are rightly seen as sort of slightly different issues. And I think we're still on the journey towards it becoming an issue of general design rather than accessibility for people with a variety of disabilities. But it does feel that we're sort of moving in that direction, where it's becoming much more prominent in design thinking, in government thinking, and hopefully in civic tech and civil society thinking as well.
Yep. Does anyone else want to chime in? Yep, Whitney.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel very optimistic about it. I reflect a lot on these virtual platforms in particular. You know, if you look at Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic to where it is now, especially in the accessibility features, it is day and night. And I think, you know, like as Ariel had mentioned, the pandemic had a few silver linings, and to me, this was one of them, was the fact that there was a heightened sense and emphasis on accessibility. And so you see these platforms now that are promoting accessibility and prioritizing it in the way that makes it more user-friendly. And so I feel really positive about it. I think, again, there's more conversations about it. And again, the disability community is growing. It is, you know, they say that it's one of the communities that you can join at any time in your life. People are living longer, you know, so I think the conversation is growing because people are having much more exposure to it. And again, I'm also feeling really positive because we're seeing more conversations about it. I mean, the fact that civic tech companies or organizations are talking about it is fantastic. And I think are a key component to the solution and being able to design and produce new types of technology and different ways to maybe make accessibility more accessible and maybe less cost prohibitive. And so, yeah, I feel really positive about it.
Yeah, and I think what you said about the accessibility features changing over time. I think Zoom originally had them locked away under a paid tier, and now the accessibility. It's really heartening seeing how people are using accessibility features on TikTok. So this is literally the next generation. This is Gen Z, and they knew that captioning, for example, is important. It's crucial to the experience. So they started putting their own captions on their TikTok videos, and that kind of shows you that the next generation is kind of clued in, sometimes in a better way than the generations before. I can't see any questions from the audience, and we do have around 3 minutes left. So I'll just ask if anyone has any final thoughts, any closing thoughts to end the conversation. Please do just unmute and go ahead. Ariel, how's it like working with Netflix? Are they as cool as they seem?
They can be very cool indeed. It's been very interesting working in the world of production companies and streaming services. It's definitely a whole nother industry, but similar to the conversation we've been having here, there is more awareness than ever before and more desire than ever before to prioritize authentic casting, authentic script writing, authentic, producing, which I think is very exciting and I think bodes well for the future. And, certainly in the US and I'm sure in many other countries, the power that entertainment media has to influence people's perceptions is it's incredible, and maybe it shouldn't be that way, but it is. So in the meantime, we'll continue to use that to our advantage and get more of the truth out about who we are as disabled people.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that. And indeed, thank you to all of our panelists. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but it's been a really, really insightful conversation. And I'm sure the audience has taken away a lot of learnings from this. Thank you, Whitney, Bonnita, Ariel, and Gavin for taking the time to share your experiences. Bonnita, especially, I know it's quite late in the evening where we are, so thank you for taking the time. And so I'm just going to share some links in the chat. This, like I mentioned in my introduction, is the final day of the Code for All Summit, but you will be able to catch a recording of this session on YouTube. So I'll just share those links now. And if you're interested in joining the Code for All community on Slack, we have a link there to join our Slack channels. It's a great place to look for collaborators and share knowledge and insights with people. You can also subscribe to the Code for All newsletter, as well as let us know what your experience of this session and the rest of the summit has been. So with that, I will say once again, thank you to our panel. Sorry, I muted myself by mistake. And thank you to our audience for turning up for this session. So yeah, thanks and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.